Why was everyone ignoring her at the briefing table? Isabella stood in the shadow of the projection screen, tablet in hand, barely acknowledged. Men who had memorized the weight of their rifles, but not her name, moved past her like she wasn't. There, the hum of strategy and adrenaline filled the tent. They all knew what was coming. Everyone had a role, except her. She was the one with bright eyes and a braid tucked under her cap. The one with a title no one respected. Communications Specialist. The one they always assumed would fold under pressure. They didn't know what she'd become when no one was looking. Major Kowalski's voice thundered through the room. Operation Phoenix Dawn. This is a capture mission. No exceptions. We go in, we come out. Precision. Control. Isabella typed as he spoke, noting radio frequencies. Team assignment, satellite. Coordinates. She didn't flinch when she wasn't called for any team. She never was. The names that were chosen: Morrison, Ramirez, Thompson, men she worked alongside for months, passed over her like she wasn't even in uniform. Jensen. Kowalski added quickly, not making eye contact. You'll stay back and monitor transmissions from base. Relay anything unusual. To headquarters. Standard procedure. Of course, standard. She nodded, because she always did. But something inside her grew quieter and heavier as the room emptied. The jokes began. Thompson muttered to Morrison on their way out. Good thing Jensen's not coming. Last thing we need is someone crying over a jammed trigger. They chuckled. She didn't. She just tucked. The command somewhere deep with the others. What they didn't see, what none of them ever saw, was the night before. And the night before that, the hours after everyone else went to bed, when Isabella was at the firing range, learning every single weapon system the base had to offer. Not because anyone asked her to, because she needed to know needed to be. Ready for the moment no one believed would come. She knew how the M4 recoiled in wind. She knew how to strip, clean, and reassemble a .50 cal blindfolded. And she knew perhaps better than anyone the raw power and complexity of the M249 saw. 17 pounds of belt-fed steel most soldiers avoided unless they had the biceps of a Greek statue. Isabella had fallen in love with it. The first time she asked to train with it, the range sergeant laughed. Jensen, that thing weighs more than your rucksack, he chuckled. Maybe try something lighter like a walkie-talkie, she smiled. But came back anyway, night after night, until she could control its recoil like breath control in yoga, until her aim, even with sustained fire, was surgical, until the kick felt less like punishment and more like purpose. But no one knew. No one cared. She was still the girl with the braid, who took notes and typed fast. They didn't see the stack of military manuals in her bunk, the way she'd mapped out every piece of terrain within 30 kilometers of FOB Reaper. They didn't know she could predict enemy movement patterns more accurately than some of the intel officers. They didn't see her quietly correcting techs who misaligned their own targeting software, or the medical skills she practiced in private, because she knew that out there, someone bleeding might depend on her hands. Not her clearance level, they didn't see, but she did. She saw how every mission picked the same soldiers, the same assumptions, the same patterns. She watched lesser-trained men go out while she stayed behind, watched opportunities slip past like helicopters she'd never board. Once, she asked to join Alpha Squad when a slot opened. She'd memorized their standard procedures. She knew their gear lists. She'd trained for it in silence. Major Kowalski didn't even hesitate. Squad cohesion matters, he told her gently, eyes already drifting past her. Private Morrison's been with them longer. She nodded. Of course, standard. The worst part wasn't the rejection. It was the slow erosion of her belief that any of it, any of her work, would ever mean anything, that all her quiet preparation would die in the shadows it was born in. Then came the transmission. Base, this is Phoenix Actual. We are taking heavy fire, multiple positions, RPGs, heavy machine guns. We need immediate backup. Isabella was alone in the comm center when it came through. She froze only for a second, then her training kicked in. She scanned the satellite feeds, pulled up the valley near Kotovo, and her stomach turned to ice. They were pinned, 12 soldiers, outnumbered, exposed in a natural bowl of land surrounded on 3 sides by high ground, enemy fighters on the ridge. Had set up a textbook ambush. Phoenix Squad was caught in the kill zone with almost no cover. No exit, no time. She'd studied that terrain, every meter of it. She knew what the maps didn't say. Where the rocks gave shelter, where brush gave camouflage, where the steep rise on the northern ridge could hide a single body moving with purpose and precision. She spoke up. "Sir, I know this terrain. There's a northern approach to the enemy's primary position that isn't visible from their current line of sight." The room froze. Patterson and Kowalski turned. "You're suggesting a tactical maneuver?" She nodded. "I'm suggesting a single operator could reach their machine gun nest from the north. Disable it, break the crossfire, give Phoenix Squad a window to escape." Kowalski scoffed. "You're talking about special operations tactics. You're not a ranger, Jensen. You're a comms tech." "Sir," she said softly, but firmly, "I've trained for this. I know the terrain, I know the weapon, and I have a clear route." The silence said everything. Finally, Colonel Patterson shook his head. "Absolutely not. You are not authorized for combat. End of discussion." The order was final. The look in his eyes said it wasn't about her safety. It was about who he believed she was and who he didn't. She sat back down. The radios crackled. Thompson's voice came again, hoarse now. "Base, we've got wounded. We're nearly out of ammo. If backup doesn't arrive now." This is it. No one spoke, and that's when Isabella made her choice. Not because it was allowed, not because it was wise, but because she couldn't sit and listen to people die. She could help while hierarchy debated doctrine. She stood. Quietly, no ceremony. She walked out of the comm center into the armory, picked up the M249, loaded it with calm, practiced hands, and stepped into the one mission no one would ever assign her, the one she had always been preparing for. What kind of soldier breaks the rules to do what's right? Isabella didn't ask for permission. She already had her answer. It echoed in every dismissive nod, every training request denied, every offhand remark that told her she wasn't enough. Not for combat, not for danger, not for this. But they were wrong. And 12 people were about to die because no one else had the imagination or the guts to act. She moved fast through the base's dim corridors, not like a rogue soldier, but like someone on assignment. Gear slung tight, boots lied against. Concrete. She passed 2 guards near the checkpoint. One of them nodded at her, mistaking the radio equipment on her vest as routine. "Signal check?" he asked. She returned a curt nod. "Command wants tighter sync." That was all it took. He waved her through, because no one expects the girl from communications to be carrying 17 pounds of sustained firepower. Outside, the wind swept low across. The rocks and the late afternoon sun glinted off distant hills. Isabella pulled her cap low, checking the GPS. Her target, the northern ridge above Phoenix Squad's position, 800 meters of open ground. Exposed from above, then a vertical scramble. Up unstable scree. To anyone else, it was suicide. To her, it was a route she'd studied, memorized, rehearsed, alone. In the dark, for months, she ran low, weaving between patches of brush and natural cover. Her breath controlled, her movements fluid, every ounce of her conditioning now paying off in the moment it mattered most. In her ear, Phoenix Squad's channel was chaos. Rodriguez is down. Morrison's not moving. Where's the damn backup? The fear in Thompson's voice cracked through her ribs like a warning shot. She whispered into her mic, knowing they'd hear it. "Suppressive fire incoming from your north. 30 seconds. Prepare to move." A beat of silence. Then, unknown station. Identify. She switched off the transmitter. This wasn't about approval anymore. It was about physics, terrain, steel, and skill. The things she had control over, the things she'd earned. She reached the base of the ridge in under 10 minutes. Her fingers raw, her lungs aching, but she climbed, hand over hand, boots slipping on gravel, knuckles bruised on sharp rock. The weight of the saw dragged her down like an anchor, but she moved with the force of purpose like the gravity of the mission pulled her upward harder than the earth tried to keep her down. The final push led to a narrow outcropping, just wide enough to belly crawl into firing position. She pressed flat, scanning. There they were. 3 insurgents manned the enemy's primary machine gun nest, 50 meters ahead, right where she'd predicted. 1 on the trigger, 1 feeding the belt, 1 on lookout, facing the valley, not the ridge. They had no idea she was there. She blinked sweat from her lashes, adjusted the bipod, chambered the first round. Her breathing slowed, focused. The way she'd practiced, she thought of all the nights she'd fired this weapon in solitude. All the time she hit center mass from 200 meters, alone, in the dark. All the hours she spent being invisible, only to become undeniable. She pressed the trigger. The M249 roared to life. 3 short bursts, controlled, efficient, merciless. The machine gun nest collapsed in chaos. The gunner fell backward, shredded by fire. The feeder tried to dive for cover. Too late, the third ran, but not far. Isabella shifted position, sweeping fire across the ridge. She wasn't just suppressing. She was rewriting the outcome below her. Phoenix Squad erupted into motion. We've got a break. Repeat, we have a break. Move. Move. They scrambled from cover, dragging wounded, using the sudden lull to reposition. Thompson's voice was back in her ear, now sharp with command. Unknown station. Whoever you are, keep that fire coming. You just bought us a shot. She didn't reply. She just kept firing. The enemy didn't give up easily. Within seconds, return fire poured toward her position. Bullets cracked the rock near her head. Shards sliced her cheek. The ridge shook with recoil and heat. But she held, round after round, burst after burst. The SAW growled like thunder under her grip, and she adjusted for heat, recoil, wind. The barrel hissed with sweat and smoke. Her knuckles bled where the charging handle bit her hand. But she didn't stop. Not even when she had to slam a fresh belt into place with shaking fingers. Not even when a round clipped her shoulder, spinning her sideways. Not even when fear threatened to pull her under, because this was the moment she was made for. Not the one they trained her for, the one she trained herself for in the valley. Phoenix Squad moved like men reborn. Morrison was alive barely, but upright. Thompson's voice rang through. Unknown station, we're exfiltrating. We owe you our lives. Whoever you are, thank you. Still, she didn't answer, because it wasn't about credit. It was about the impossible suddenly becoming real. The sound of retreating boots echoed through the valley. The enemy began to fall back, confused, scattered, broken. Their advantage was gone, their firepower shattered. Their ambush undone. Isabella fired until her final belt clicked dry. Then she exhaled, heavy, slow, eyes scanning the silence she'd created with steel and will. She keyed her mic. This time, she spoke softly, only for herself. They're safe. Then she crawled backward, disappearing from the ridge. The ghost of a girl they never expected. What do you say when the person who just saved your life isn't supposed to exist? Phoenix Squad limped back into the base at dusk, exhausted, battered, and carrying their wounded. Their uniforms were torn, faces bloodied, eyes hollow from what they'd seen and survived, but they were alive, and they shouldn't have been. 12 men had walked into a kill zone. 12 men had walked out, and none of them could explain how. The debriefing was chaos. Major Kowalski demanded answers. Colonel Patterson barked questions. Everyone wanted to know who had provided the covering fire from the northern ridge. There'd been no authorized units in the area, no air support, no reinforcement. But someone had taken out the enemy's primary position with brutal precision and bought Phoenix Squad the 10 minutes they needed to escape. Sergeant Thompson said. At first, quietly, I think it was Jensen. Silence. Then Morrison bandaged, limping, still pale spoke. I saw her, just before we cleared the valley, on the ridge, M249 in her hands. Looked like she'd been there for hours. Colonel. Patterson's jaw clenched. Impossible. Jensen is communications. She was stationed at command during the entire operation. Sir, Thompson said carefully, we all know who was assigned where, but I'm telling you what I saw. No one spoke for a moment. Then Kowalski muttered, pull surveillance. Logs, check perimeter cams. If she left the base, we'll know. They did. And there she was, at 13:59, walking past checkpoint Alpha, gear on, eyes forward, her credentials scanned. Her posture calm. No one had stopped her. No one had questioned her. Because no one ever thought the girl from communications could be dangerous. That night, Isabella was detained. She didn't resist. She sat in a chair under harsh lights, hands resting on her knees, face calm, bruised shoulder, cracked lip, dried blood at her temple. Colonel Patterson stood over her, voice flat. Do you deny leaving the base without authorization? No, sir. You conducted an armed assault against entrenched enemy positions. Alone. Yes, sir. You disobeyed a direct order and violated every chain of command protocol we have in place. She nodded once. Yes, sir. Why? She didn't hesitate, because they were dying, and I could help. Patterson stared at her for a long time. Then, do you understand the consequences of what you've done? Yes, sir. The room felt heavy with something bigger than punishment. Something deeper than protocol, because here was the truth they couldn't ignore anymore. She had done the impossible. And she had done it alone. That night, Command held an emergency session. There was no easy answer. On paper, Isabella had committed insubordination, unauthorized combat engagement, violation of perimeter protocols, and unapproved weapons deployment. But she had also saved 12 lives in what military analysts would later call a tactically unwinnable ambush. Her actions, though unauthorized, had been the only reason Phoenix Squad survived. Colonel Patterson stood before the assembled officers, voice tight. We are looking at a soldier who disobeyed orders and demonstrated capabilities far beyond her assigned role. Major Kowalski rubbed his temples. She was right about the terrain, about the fire support window, about everything. She pulled off a solo maneuver that would challenge a seasoned operator. She's not even on a combat roster, someone muttered. Maybe that's our failure. Another officer replied quietly. The final decision was split. Isabella would receive an official reprimand for disobeying orders. But no. Court-martial, no discharge. Instead, a reassignment to the one place her talents could finally be recognized. She was transferred from communications to infantry, assigned to advanced weapons training, and given a new title, Staff Sergeant Isabella Jensen. The announcement spread through Fob Reaper like wildfire. The girl with the braid was no longer just a Comstech. She was the woman who'd faced death alone and won. The base wasn't sure how to process that. Some whispered, some laughed nervously. Some saluted, but none of them ignored her anymore. Not after what she'd done. Phoenix Squad visited her the day after the announcement. Thompson was first. You didn't just save us, he said. You embarrassed every one of us. We never gave you a chance. She looked him in the eyes. You gave me all the reason I needed to prepare. Morrison shook his head, still not quite believing it. You carried the saw like it was a dam. Extension of your arm. How? I trained, she said simply. Every night you didn't see me. He looked at the ground. You deserve better than what we gave you. I didn't do it for that, Isabella replied. Then why? Her voice softened. Because I couldn't listen to you die. Not when I knew I could stop it, he nodded, swallowing hard. From that moment, everything changed. Not just for Isabella, for the entire base. Major Kowalski met with her in private, a mix of pride and guilt in his voice. "You've shown me something I didn't want to admit," he said. "We've built this system to be efficient, but it's become blind. We keep looking at uniforms, records, appearances, when we should be looking at capability." Isabella said nothing. He continued, "You broke every rule, but you reminded us what those rules are supposed to protect. Lives, mission success, tactical truth." She raised an eyebrow. "And what now?" Kowalski leaned back. "Now, we learned from you." Later that week, she stood before a new class of recruits. The M249 slung across her chest, not as defiance, but as declaration. "The SAW isn't just a machine gun," she told them. "It's responsibility firepower. Like this can hold a line or break it. It doesn't care how tall you are, or what you weigh, or what anyone thinks you can't do." They listened, because now her voice carried weight. Because she had proven the only thing that matters on. The battlefield isn't approval, it's readiness. What happens when the system that doubted you suddenly depends on you? 6 months ago, Isabella had eaten lunch alone, forgotten in the background, her uniform blending into the scenery. Now, soldiers she didn't even know asked if she could look over their shooting form. Even sergeants paused when she spoke in briefings. But respect, real respect, doesn't come with rank. It comes from scars. She never asked to be treated differently, but everything had changed since Phoenix Dawn. She wore the maroon beret of an airborne infantry specialist now, but when she walked the halls of FOB Reaper, she carried something heavier than the M249. The weight of others' expectations and their silence. Not long after her reassignment, Colonel Patterson called her into his office. Again, but this time, he wasn't leaning over a reprimand sheet. This time, he offered her something else. "Staff Sergeant Jensen," he said, voice clipped but not cold. "We're formalizing a new program, Tactical Cross-Training Initiative. I want you to lead the first module." She blinked. "You want me to train combat troops?" "I want you to train soldiers," he corrected, "regardless of role. Because what happened out there, what you did, it exposed a flaw. We've been treating talent like a locked cabinet. You've shown it's more like a loaded rifle. It doesn't matter where you keep it. It matters when it's needed." Isabella didn't respond at first. She wasn't used to being asked. She was used to fighting just to be seen. Then she nodded. Once, "Yes, sir." Her first class was a strange mix. Some volunteers, some assigned, a few skeptical NCOs watching from the back. She stood in front of them, M249 in hand, and said nothing for a long moment. Then, "Who here thinks this weapon is too heavy for someone my size?" No one answered, not out loud, but some of you thought it. Same way they thought it in my first month here. The weapon didn't change. I did. She walked to the firing line and set the weapon down with care. Her fingers moved quickly, stripping it down, piece by piece. When you understand something deeply enough, its parts, its limitations, its purpose, suddenly size doesn't matter. What matters is readiness, repetition, intention. She looked up, and sometimes rage that earned a few glances. She didn't clarify. She didn't have to, because everyone in that room had felt it. The burn of being overlooked, the fury of being underestimated, the ache of carrying capability no one ever asks for. Private Chun, a young logistics officer, raised her hand. "What made you train like that? All those months? With no guarantee anyone would ever let you fight?" Isabella gave her a long look, because I didn't need permission to be prepared. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was reverent. After class, several soldiers stayed behind, asking questions about recoil control, tactical terrain, grip endurance. They weren't just learning how to fire the SAW. They were learning how to see themselves differently. Isabella stayed late that night, cleaning gear, Logging supplies, alone again, but not lonely, because now her solitude wasn't invisibility. It was purpose, recovery, recharging. But change comes with resistance. A week later, an older staff sergeant cornered her near the mess hall. "I'll say it straight, Jensen," he said, arms folded. "I respect what you did, but I don't think everyone needs to be cross-training on combat gear. There's a reason we specialize, a reason we have structure." She met his eyes calmly. Structure didn't save Phoenix Squad. He flinched, just barely. "You think what you did is scalable? That everyone should start training like a commando?" "I think everyone should train like their teammates' lives might depend on it," she replied. He walked away, shaking his head. But her words had landed, because a few days later, his name showed up on her class roster. Change is slow, but not impossible, especially when it's delivered by someone who has already done the impossible. By month's end, Isabella's program had become the most requested module on base, not because of the gear or the gun or even the results. It was the tone she set, a tone built on one idea: you are more than the box they put you in. She started integrating real-world problem-solving into her lessons. Instead of just teaching firepower, she taught tactical foresight, what to do when radios fail, when maps lie, when orders contradict reality, when no one's coming. Because sometimes you are the only solution. Her impact reached higher than she realized. During a base review, a visiting general asked Colonel Patterson about the new weapons module. "She teaches mindset," Patterson said, "and forces us to re-examine who we think our warfighters are, even if it means promoting." "A little disobedience?" the general asked. Patterson cracked a rare smile. "Sometimes discipline needs an exception." Isabella never sought credit. She still avoided the spotlight. But word spread. A soldier in Romania wrote asking for her training manuals. A female engineer in Qatar requested video breakdowns of her firing positions. And back at Reaper, a quiet wave of young recruits had started sneaking in extra range time after hours. Just like she had, Isabella sometimes watched them from a distance, silent, driven, unseen, and she smiled. Because legacy isn't built in ceremony, it's built in repetition, in resistance, in refusal to be less than what you know you are. When do you stop being the exception and start changing the rules? It started small. A supply tech requested marksmanship training during her off hours. Then, a field medic signed up for advanced terrain navigation. Then 2 cooks from base logistics, who weren't even combat begged to borrow her manuals. By the time Isabella noticed the shift, it was already in motion. People were quietly reshaping their own limits because someone had dared to ignore hers. One morning, Isabella stood outside the armory, watching as a squad of new recruits passed through gear inspection. Their instructor, a grizzled sergeant who used to avoid her, now handed her the clipboard without a word. She signed it, handed it back, and he said, "They're all yours, Sergeant." No sarcasm, no eye roll, just recognition. But with recognition comes weight and whispers. That week, rumors began. Some said she was angling for special ops recruitment. Others said she was going too far, undermining the chain of command. A few questioned whether her success in Phoenix Dawn had been overstated. It was always like that. They accept the miracle, but question the miracle worker. Colonel Patterson summoned her again. He sat behind his desk, formal as ever, but his words were careful this time. "You're becoming a symbol," he said. "Some see that as hope, others see it as disruption." Isabella stayed still. Patterson sighed. "We're getting inquiries from other bases, requests for your methods. Your name's showing up in training reports at division level. That kind of visibility comes with scrutiny, and not everyone is ready for what you represent." "What do I represent?" she asked. He looked her dead in the eye. "Possibility." She stood, saluted, and said, "Then I won't apologize for it. The truth was, she never wanted to be a symbol. She just wanted to be useful. But somewhere along the way, her refusal to wait for permission had become a movement. Even the doubters had started to shift. During a base-wide training exercise, Isabella was asked to lead the OP-4 team opposing force for a simulated insurgent scenario. That role had always been reserved for combat-hardened infantry leaders. Now it was hers. She approached the role methodically, as she always had. She studied the terrain, analyzed the patrol patterns, predicted the mistakes the trainees would make. Then she set the trap. Her team, a cobbled-together group of underused personnel, techs, medics, 2 female mechanics, and a drone operator for mess duty, executed flawlessly. The opposing squad, led by a traditionalist sergeant who'd scoffed at the exercise, was wiped out in under 15 minutes. During the post-mission review, he shook his head. "I didn't expect them to move like that," he muttered. Isabella, standing beside the whiteboard, replied coolly, "That's because you still think capability comes with a certain look." He didn't argue. He just listened. That night, Isabella returned to her quarters and opened the envelope that had been waiting for her. A commendation from Central Command. Attached was a formal request. Assess the viability of expanding cross-functional training programs across multiple FOBs. Recommend personnel structure, draft curriculum, lead implementation. She was being asked to help rewire the system that once refused to let her hold a rifle. She read the memo twice, then folded it carefully and tucked it into her rucksack right next to the photo of Phoenix Squad taken weeks after their ambush. In it, they all stood with her, arms around each other, smiling like survivors who finally understood what earned loyalty looked like. Later, while reviewing footage from her recent training exercises, Isabella noticed something she hadn't planned for. Private Chun, the quiet one from Supply, had started mimicking her movement style, using terrain the same way Isabella had during her solo rescue. A corporal in base security now logged extra hours on the M249, practicing the same stances Isabella taught herself. She wasn't just teaching tactics anymore. She was teaching mindset. She was passing on the lesson that had nearly cost her everything. No one can limit your preparation but you. Late that night, she sat alone on the range, cleaning her weapon under the moonlight, just like she used to, before anyone believed she could even carry it. Except now, she wasn't alone. One by one, soldiers showed up beside her, quietly, wordlessly, a kind of silent communion. Someone brought ammo. Another set up targets. By midnight, 10 soldiers, some combat, some not, were firing in sequence, sharpening, pushing, rewriting what they thought they could be. And Isabella? She just smiled, because finally she didn't have to carry it all herself. What do you do when the very system that once silenced you asks for your voice? Isabella stood at a podium she never thought she'd be invited to. The briefing room at Central Command was larger than she imagined. Rows of uniforms, higher ranks than she'd ever addressed. A sea of ribbons, stripes, and skeptics behind her. On the projection screen glowed the words, "Beyond roles, tactical adaptability and unrecognized capability in modern warfare." She hadn't chosen the title. They had. All she'd chosen was to show up. Her voice didn't shake. Not anymore. 6 months ago, she began. "I was a comm specialist who wasn't allowed to carry a rifle outside of inventory checks. I wasn't trained for combat, not officially. I wasn't assigned to missions, not really. But I prepared anyway." She let the silence stretch. Measured, controlled. On the day Phoenix Squad was ambushed, every protocol, we had failed them. Response times, air support, logistics, doctrine, none of it could reach them in time. She paused, then continued, softer. "The only thing that could was a soldier no one considered a soldier." A few officers shifted in their seats. She leaned forward slightly. "I don't tell this story to glorify disobedience. I tell it to expose a blind spot." Click. A slide changed behind her. Training. Footage, graphs, heat maps, then a still photo from the ridge. The burned-down machine gun nest where she'd set up her saw. Capability exists where you don't always authorize it. Talent doesn't wait for your permission, and sometimes the soldier you overlook is the one who saves everyone. By the time she finished, the room was silent again, but this silence felt different. It felt like belief. After the presentation, a general approached her privately. He didn't smile, but he did say, "We've been needing this perspective for a long time. You forced us to face it." Isabella didn't respond with gratitude. She simply said, "Now use it." When she returned to FOB Reaper, the air felt different. Something had shifted, not in how people treated her, but in how they treated themselves. Private Chun had been promoted. Her file now listed combat qualified. After passing advanced weapons certs, Isabella had once been denied. Rodriguez, once one of her critics, was now co-instructing her terrain analysis module. And the comes tent where Isabella had once sat alone, dismissed and silent, it had been converted into a joint operations planning room, because capability didn't belong in the back of the room anymore. One night, Isabella was reviewing training requests when Sergeant Thompson knocked gently on her office door. He stepped in, hands behind his back. Something in his eyes looked uncertain, like a man about to admit something uncomfortable. "Can I ask you something?" He said, "Of course. Back in the valley when we were pinned, I kept thinking we were dead. All of us. I remember hearing that saw kick off behind us, and I couldn't believe it. I still can't." He swallowed. Then, softly, "Weren't you scared?" She leaned back in her chair. "I was terrified," she said, "but I was more afraid of doing nothing." He nodded slowly. "I used to think strength came from certainty, orders, cohesion, the system. It still can," she said. "But sometimes strength is choosing to act before anyone gives you permission." Thompson looked at her for a long time. "I'm glad you did." Before he left, he stopped in the doorway. "You changed how we see ourselves, Jensen, not just how we see you." That night, Isabella walked the base alone, listening to the sounds of late-night drills, hushed conversations, distant rifle clicks. She passed the range where someone was quietly running saw drills in the dark, just like she had. She didn't interrupt. She just watched, letting the ripple continue. It had always been about more than the ridge, more than the ambush, more than the gun. It had been about the quiet battle she fought long before bullets started flying. The battle to believe in herself when no one else did. The battle to prepare when no one asked her to. The battle to act when no one authorized it. And now, others were preparing too, not because they were told to, but because she'd shown them they could. "When the world finally listens, what do you say?" They asked her to speak again, this time at Fort Bragg, a leadership summit. Commanders, trainers, policy officers, people who built the doctrine that shaped the military machine, Isabella wore. Her maroon beret, her uniform crisp, her expression measured. But something about the request made her feel like she was walking back into that tent the first day at FOB Reaper when no one looked at her twice, only now. They couldn't look away. She stood before a projection of a topographical map valley. Ridgelines, fallback routes all color-coded, annotated. "This is where Phoenix Squad was trapped," she said, and this, she pointed to a narrow line most people missed, was the one route I knew no one else would try. She turned to the room, because I was the only one they hadn't trained to expect. A few nervous chuckles, a few dead stares. I wasn't part of the plan. I wasn't in the mission brief. I wasn't even considered for reinforcement. Pause. But I was ready. Another slide. Images of her notes, hand-drawn terrain sketches, weapons manuals marked up, language flashcards, all from the months before Phoenix Dawn. All from the shadows. I trained without recognition. I studied without guidance. I prepared without certainty that I'd ever use any of it. A colonel in the front row raised a hand. Why not file a formal reassignment request? Isabella looked at him, calm, tired. I did. 3 times it was redirected. Politely. More silence then. So what changed? Someone else asked. I did. She said simply. No anger. Just truth. Later, she sat alone in the back of the auditorium, arms folded. One of the junior officers who'd attended approached her. Not to challenge, not to congratulate, to ask, "How do you know when you're ready, Sergeant?" Isabella thought for a moment. "You don't," she said. "You prepare anyway." The next morning, she returned to FOB Reaper. No fanfare, no applause. But her inbox was full. Requests from units in Germany, Poland, Okinawa, and Djibouti, commanders. Asking for her curriculum, asking for her philosophy. It was surreal, and it was exhausting, because behind every success, she still carried the weight of every dismissal. Every moment when she wasn't seen, wasn't chosen, wasn't trusted. She didn't forget. Not when she watched recruits now lining up to sign into the cross-training initiative. Not when she passed her old bunk and saw someone else young, small, quiet flipping through a weapons manual late at night. Not when Sergeant Rodriguez pulled her aside during chow. "We've got a new girl," he said. Similar story. Admin specialist. Right. No one's taking her seriously yet. Isabella raised an eyebrow. "Is she any good?" Rodriguez smiled. "She reminds me of someone." That night, Isabella found her at the range, alone, firing in short, careful bursts. Her form was off, but her eyes were focused. "You mind if I show you something?" Isabella asked. The girls' eyes widened. "Your Staff Sergeant Jensen." "Not tonight," she said. "Tonight, I'm just the one who trained in the dark." They worked through the night, positioning, breath control, ammo belt loading, recoil compensation, and when the sun started to rise, the girl finally asked, quietly, "Do you ever regret it? Going against orders?" Isabella didn't answer right away. Then, slowly, "No, I regret that it had to come to that." She looked down at the weapon in her lap, the same one that had once been deemed too heavy for her. Too complex, too ambitious. She patted the receiver. "This thing didn't save lives," she said. "Preparation did." The girl nodded, not quite understanding yet, but she would, because that's how it starts. Not with applause, not with headlines, but with one person who sees what others won't. One person who decides, "If no one lets me in, I'll make my own way through." When everything you believed in is proven true, what's left? 6 months after Phoenix Dawn, the culture at FOB Reaper had changed. Not overnight, not completely, but meaningfully. You could feel it in the way new soldiers approached training, not like boxes to be checked, but as tools to be sharpened. You could hear it in the voices of instructors who no longer taught skill by job title, but by need. You could see it in the field when a mechanic picked up a rifle with practiced precision, or a medic used terrain to flank during an exercise. And you could trace it all back to one woman, Staff Sergeant Isabella Jensen. The girl, they said, was too delicate, too small, too emotional. The one who listened quietly while being told she didn't belong in combat. The one who trained when no one asked her to, who learned in silence and acted alone until she didn't have to, because now there were others. She stood in front of her new unit, part of a pilot program designed to implement her methods across multiple deployments. 30 soldiers from different backgrounds, different specialties, different ranks, all chosen not for what they had been assigned, but for what they might become. This isn't a course, Isabella told them on day 1. It's a question, a pause. What are you capable of? When no one's watching? No one replied. She didn't need them to, because she'd lived the answer later that week. Colonel Sarah Martinez, the new CO of FOB Reaper, visited her during training. She watched as Isabella walked her unit through live-fire M249 drills. "They look at you like you rewrote the manual," Martinez said. I didn't rewrite it, Isabella replied. I just read it like I wasn't supposed to. Martinez smiled. Sometimes that's enough. That night, Isabella returned. To her quarters, she sat at her desk and opened a folder labeled After Action Reports, Phoenix Dawn. She flipped through the pages. There it was again, black ink on white paper. Official and unchanging. Mission outcome: successful casualties, minimal intervention. Unauthorized. Result: lives saved. She stared at the last line for a long time. Then, without ceremony, she slid the folder back into the drawer and pulled out a fresh notebook. On the first page, she wrote, "Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts." She closed the cover. Outside, the base lights flickered on. The sound of training drills echoed faintly across the gravel. Isabella stood, stretched her arms, and stepped into the hallway because readiness didn't rest and legacy didn't wait. And somewhere out there, another soldier was being told she wasn't enough. And somewhere soon she would prove everyone wrong, just like Isabella had.